Okay, so when we think about this topic, when we're thinking about depression and anxiety, I have a bit of a passion for this topic because I must confess, when I was younger, in my mid-20s, I actually had a mental breakdown. So this is something that's very much deeply on my heart and something I've worked through lots of my time in faith. And many of us can come to a point in our life where we feel we're consumed by the moments in our life, by effects of the decisions we've made, of anything that's come along in our lives. There can be anxieties and worries for situations that are occurring in our life. And these can be very debilitating, can't they? They can overwhelm us and feel like they control our lives. And so when we're thinking of anxiety and depression, sometimes it isn't just a case of feeling a bit down. This can also encompass that feeling of complete not knowing what to do, a kind of despair, like I can't control this. So what we want to do today is see how there's some ways to get ourselves out of that situation, or if we know, like I said, if we know people in that situation, to lead them to some truths here in God's word that can help them. Now, I remember early in my life, my whole life was formed and pointing towards a career in the RAF. I wanted to be a fighter pilot. That's all I ever dreamed of. I was like, this is it. This is the direction my life's going to go in. I worked really hard in school, even though I'm not academically bright, and I struggled in lots of areas. And I had this goal, this victory that I wanted to attain, and I pushed really hard in school to get there and get to that point. But it got to a point where I one day turned up to the Air Cadets, and the careers guy came in from one of the squadrons and had a chat, and then found out that actually I could never become a pilot because of the type of asthma I had when I was a young boy, even though I didn't suffer as much anymore. And he said, no, that's no chance whatsoever. So me, just about to go to college, having got the best college in the area, having got the best results I ever could, completely crushed, completely having a moment of crisis in my life. Not expecting this to happen. This wasn't going the way I wanted. This wasn't the victory I'd expected. And there, it just kind of potted about in my life then from that little moment in college, not knowing what to do, until I was given new direction. And thankfully my dad helped me find some new direction in my life and something that I could go for. But I wonder how many of us have gone through a similar thing in our lives, a moment we've been aiming towards, or something's come in that's completely changed the direction of our life, or crushed us, or given us a crisis of confidence. Well, I think this is what we're seeing today in this passage in Elijah. I think the wonderful thing about God's word is the Bible speaks about the past and sheds light on the issues we face today using those examples. So for us today, this Elijah passage gives us two areas I think we can look at in our understanding of depression and anxiety. Firstly, this passage helps us to see that sometimes we give up. And secondly, this passage helps us see that God provides and restores. So as we've seen and as we've heard from what Elijah has done in chapter 19, there's a point where he's given up. He's consumed really with some self-loathing, but yet there's times of provision. This is a massive change in the life of Elijah, a massive change from the character and the person that we have seen already through the things that he has done. He's come from a great, mighty position of doing some amazing things or working for God in amazing ways. God has worked through him and he's seen some great things. Like we've said, this moment where this offering has been soaked in water and the Lord brought fire down upon it and consumed it. Where a young boy in the house he's staying has died and been brought back to life. Where he has said the rain is going to stop and not come about, and then it has done for a few years, and then the rain comes again. Elijah has seen these amazing and wonderful things, and throughout he seems to have been this strong character, this man standing up against the king Ahab. So when we look at this passage, I think there's something wonderful for us to understand. There's an encouragement for us to see that someone mighty, someone who's probably only second to Moses in the Old Testament as being the most important person, has had a massive failure or a massive dip in who they are. It can encourage us because sometimes we see other people who are Christians, we read about these great heroes and we think, I could never be like that. Oh my goodness, they're so great. I could never get to that position. We read of heroes of faith, like I'm reading at the moment a book that tells of the heroes of the faith and all the wonderful things that they did, that God did through them. And you can go, whoa, I'm nowhere near that. You could make them into kind of this superhero Christian that you need to live up to. But actually, this passage shows us that all of these people, Elijah, Moses, anyone else you think about that you hold high are still only human. They're still fallible and prone to weakness. So this brings us to our first point. Sometimes we give up. As I said, Elijah has achieved a great victory, hasn't he? He's just overcome something wonderful. And it's probably not what he expected to happen afterwards. He thought, now, right, okay, we've defeated this false god. All these prophets of this false god have gone. The thing I want to desire, or the thing to come out of that I would hope for now is that, look, the whole of Israel is going to turn back to the right God, the true God. The king's going to have his mind changed. There's going to be none of this idol worship anymore. But it hasn't turned out how he's expected. Like I said, this happens to us in our lives. Sometimes things don't turn out how we expect them to turn out. There seems to be an uncharacteristic fear and lack of faith in these opening verses. We look at verse 1 to 2, and we see that as Ahab has told Jezebel everything that Elijah has done, these prophets have all been killed by the sword. So she's just enraged by this. And as it says in verse 2, she sends out a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." This is a threat to his life. It's not just a threat, it's an oath. She promises, you're going to die if you hang around. I wonder, would we do the same in the situation as Elijah? In this, you might be thinking that Elijah stands firm, this mighty man of God. But actually, as we see in verse 3, he was afraid. He ran for his life. Would we do the same? We might well do the same, mightn't we? He's focusing really on his present situation, isn't he? The present situation of the fact that he's about to be in trouble. He's had a messenger come and tell him that if you don't get out of here, it's going to be the end of you. He's not, though, done what he's done in every other situation, which is to look to the Lord, to look to God, to look to the eternal things. And that there is his big mistake in this moment of time. He's been caught up and consumed in the circumstances of his life now, and in thinking human wisdom-wise, what can I do? He's not looked to God first. He's not looked for God's understanding or God's instructional wisdom in this situation. He's fled as far as he could go from Jezreel, away from the people and away from the nation. But as we said, God hasn't instructed this journey. He hasn't asked God, should I go on this journey? Should I go and get away? If you're wondering how far he's fled, if you think of the map of Israel, Jezreel's at the top, and then he's gone right down to the bottom near the Negev, which is the wilderness, the desert area at the bottom. It's 108 miles he's travelled. 108 miles. It's about 3 to 5 days' journey. So he's properly legged it, hasn't he? He's properly got out of there. And he wants to get far away from this situation, far away from these people. In his mind, this is the last journey. He says, that's it, I've got to get out of here, and that's it. I can't work there anymore. I can't work under these circumstances. It hasn't happened how I want it to be. So by the time he gets down to the bottom here, 3 to 5 days, hard walking, 108 miles. He's exhausted physically. He's exhausted mentally. And then he lays down. We see that, lays down. Verse 4, he's given up. He's praying to die. He feels his ministry is over. It's done with. What else can I do in this situation? Look at that in verse 4, these words. He came to a broom bush, which is basically a big old tree. It's got loads of shade. He sat down under it and he prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. I wonder if we get exhausted sometimes. When we, in the same way as Elijah, find situations overwhelming, we can't see a way out of the situation. Everything in that moment of life is overwhelming. Can we relate to these words that he says? I've had enough. He's basically saying that, isn't he? I've had enough. I can't go on. As he said, this is enough now. Take away my life. I'm no better than my fathers. He's a high achiever, isn't he? Imagine that in working life, they're high achieving people. This is what I've set out to do. I haven't attained this goal. Crushed. This is what I set out to do. I thought if this happened, then everything's going to be different in Israel. But it hasn't happened the way I want, Elijah's thinking. I'm no better than my forefathers, all those people that failed to idolatry and didn't change anything in Israel. I'm no better than them. It hasn't worked. What's the point of me being here anymore? My ministry's not working at all. I want things done my way, the way I wanted it to go. It's not meant to be like this. And it's interesting, isn't it, that now when he's got to the bottom of this journey, he now wants to die, whereas before he's fleeing for his life. That doesn't seem to make sense, does it? But you can imagine that on this long journey as he's gone down from the north to the south, that he's had lots of time to think over, to mull over everything. And he's not worried about his life anymore because he's just thinking, there's nothing else for my ministry to do. There's nowhere else I can go with it now. But he's not contemplating suicide here. That's the really interesting thing. He's not saying, I'm going to take my life. He still understands that God is the one who's sovereign over life. God is the one who is in control, who is the one who gives life and takes life away. That's why he says, you, Lord, take my life. I can't handle this anymore. And there seems to be something familiar in these words that he's saying. We can think back to Jonah as well, can't we? Jonah says something very similar. He's overburdened by the situation he's in, and he doesn't feel it's going the way he wants. And so he says, Lord, just take my life. There's no point me continuing on the mission. You're going to do what you're going to do anyway. And there's another moment as well in the Old Testament of Moses. Moses is just fed up a little bit with the people, and he says, well, I don't seem to be able to affect anything. This isn't working. In Numbers 11:15, he says the similar thing. Well, you may as well just take me out of the situation, God, because nothing's going on how I would expect it to be. Is this really what it's meant to be like? And what we see in these situations, I think, and especially here in this Elijah one, I think there's been a lack of faith. He's had that moment where he's had a lack of faith at the beginning. He's gone into that kind of cycle of self-pity, of self-loathing. He's really had enough of himself, and he's thinking, I've failed. What else can I do? All I can do is give up my ministry now. It's not worked. Could that be our response sometimes when we see the situations not go the way we would want? We can go into that pit of saying, it's because of me. It's all gone wrong because of me. Why? Of course it wouldn't go right. Look at me. And then we start to internalize. We start to look at ourselves and we start to think, it's all me. It's all me. I'm the one that's done this. I'm the one that's gone wrong here. And we go to that self-loathing. We think, Lord, there's nothing else to do. There's no way I can see out of this. There's no way I could get out of this situation. We may even think we're better than others sometimes. Like here, we think, oh yeah, I'm better than this situation. I'm better than these people. Why hasn't it gone round how I want? There's lots of things that could be added into why we would be having a lack of faith or a loathed state in that moment of time. So, for me, I see the application here for us is that Elijah has had a dip from the person he was. He's taking his eyes off the ball in the sense he's taken his eyes off God, and he's focused on the situations of now and put his worldly wisdom into the situation. He's gone from the path he was meant to be on. Like we said, he hadn't asked God, should I be going down here? He's just gone on a path on his own. He's focused on his earthly difficulties, not about eternal things. And that could be really easy to do in our lives. This isn't a judgment to have a go at people. This is to understand that this can happen for all of us. One defeat in our life, one big problem that comes about, can actually offset the many moments of glorious victory that God has brought in our lives. We can easily forget what God has done in our lives from one moment, one thing, where God has shown his power, where the Lord Jesus has worked wonderful things through our lives, where if we look back and saw the moments, we would go, wow, how great. But we know what it's like. It's like words, isn't it? You say one bad word to someone, and it probably takes 100 words to correct that one bad word. It can have a great effect on us. And just think of that one most amazing thing that God has done for us. That through God's power, through Christ, we have been saved. That moment of salvation can be offset by just one moment of a big problem, of a dark thing. We can forget, if God can do that, if he can take me out of darkness, out of the mire, he can save someone like me, then why can he not sort this situation out? Why can he not turn this situation into his glory or my good? So that first point is for us to think about the fact that we reach the end. Sometimes we get to the end of the capacity that we can deal with the situation. And it's not a freak thing to think, oh, I've been overwhelmed. That makes me a subpar human being. That makes me a subpar Christian, that I've been overwhelmed and I can't deal with things. The reality is that at some point, even great people that we think are wonderful Christians may face the same issue and point. But does it have to be this way? Verse 9, that question that God asks Elijah, why are you here? Why are you here? There's a slightly challenging tone to that in the original language. Why are you here? What are you doing here at this moment? And it's helpful for us to think now, that first point, we have a capacity that overwhelms us. We get to the end. We can't do everything that we thought we would. We are overwhelmed. We are feeling like we just need to give up. But then in that situation, God provides and restores us. And that's what happens for Elijah. He's in that moment where he's given up. But as we see, God provides and restores Elijah. Now he's asleep, isn't he, underneath this broom bush, this big bush. He's gone to sleep. How many of us just feel like we need to do that sometimes? Just have a nice rest. And I'd encourage you, when you feel just gone, before making big decisions, make sure you get your rest. But in this hopeless state, he's only been focusing on one thing, that messenger from Jezebel. That is the only message he's had. That's the words he's had that's made him take this big journey. God hasn't spoken to him yet. And now God does speak to him. God now sends his messenger to Elijah to intervene, to speak to Elijah and begin bringing him back to where he needs to be. We see that in verse 5 and verse 6. Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. All at once, an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate, drank, and then lay down again. This is God beginning to bring Elijah back where he needs to be, to provide for him, to take him on the path of where he needs to go. It's God's plan and his desire. And what we see here is an amazing thing. Sometimes we overlook miracles, don't we? When we see a miracle in the Bible, we just read past it, go, okay, but look at this wonderful thing that's just happened here. Out of nowhere, food has just appeared by his head. That's better than Deliveroo, isn't it? You know, it just, boom, straight there. Food, didn't even order it, it's there for me. And it's what I need. And when you look at some of the things that's going on in these little verses here, he's touched him. The intimacy there, the thing we miss, intimacy, touched, I'm going to get you up, eat this is what you need. Right now, God says, this is what you need. I'm going to do this gently with you. I'm going to help you through. And afterwards, he goes, right, I've eaten that food, I've fallen back asleep. Because sometimes we do need that. We need a bit of food, sustenance, and then back to sleep again, some extra rest. And then the angel of the Lord comes back a second time and gets him up again. This is a gentle bringing Elijah back to where he needs to be. Again, I think there's parallels with Jonah's life and what goes on with Jonah. In the same way, God starts to bring Jonah back to where he needs to be. He's a bit more stronger with Jonah than he is with Elijah. He's a bit more forceful with Jonah than he is with Elijah. And I think that's a reflection in the ways that some people in a state of depression or anxiety need to be dealt with. Some people need to be dealt with gently to help through the situation they're in. Other people do need a big kick to get going, but it depends on the personality and who they are. But isn't it great that God knows in each situation what people need in those situations? So as I said, God's mighty power and miraculous power is on display. God is providing Elijah with what he needs in that situation. As it says in verse 6 to 7, he looked around and there in his head was some bread baked over the hot coals, a jar of water. He gives those things to drink. He goes to sleep, he gets back up, and then in verse 7, the angel of the Lord says, "Get up and eat, for your journey is too much for you." So he's given him everything he needs for the present moment and everything he needs for the future. And who is it that's given Elijah these things? It's the angel of the Lord. And we may know that the angel of the Lord is pointing towards someone very special. That's the pre-incarnate Jesus. This is the Son of God. This is him coming intimately into Elijah's life to say, this is what you need, I'm here for you, and I give you the fuel for what you need now and what you need for later. Basically, he's saying, I'm fueling your exhausted body, and I'm going to spiritually sustain you for the next 40 days in your journey, because I'm sending you to Mount Horeb, which is Mount Sinai, the mountain of God. He's sending him into the presence of God. and he's given him everything he needs to sustain for that journey. Elijah is not finished. God is not finished with Elijah. His journey is not over. He's travelled all this way down, and he thought, that's it. I've decided the end is there. God said, no. Your journey is going to continue because I'm actually going to bring you back up. Because I think in the geography where he settles is there, and the Mount Sinai is around a little bit further up. So he's gone down to come back up again. It's all, I think, pointing towards God bringing him back to where he needs to be. And I just think this is wonderful and amazing. Wonderful and amazing, because let's think about this number again for 40 days and the sustenance and the sustaining power of God. This brings us back to other moments of 40 in the Bible. Let's think of Moses. He was in the presence of God for 40 days, wasn't he? And at that time, did he have anything to eat and drink? It says he was sustained, wasn't he? He had nothing there. Again, a thing in common. We have Israel, 40 years in the wilderness. They didn't have the food or drink. Who sustained them in that time? God. And then we have Jesus, 40 days of temptation in the wilderness, and he didn't have anything there. He was sustained spiritually. This points us to something very, very important. For when we're in those moments of anxiety, of fear, of worry, when we're in the midst of deep, dark depression, God is the one who can sustain your life, who can give you what you need, not just physically, but spiritually. And that's where the battle is going on here. With depression, it is a mental thing. It's a spiritual thing. And this is where God can help. God will help those people in that dark place. Like we saw before, he'll bring them out the mire. He'll provide the fuel needed for now in the present and what you need in the future. That's a wonderful thing to hold on to. But where does he go after this? He's being sustained, yes, but he's going towards the mountain. And when he gets to the mountain, where does he go? He goes into a cave. We see that. He goes into a cave. Now, this is interesting, isn't it? This is the same cave, I think. In the language, if you look at it, it's the same cave where Moses, sat in the cleft of the mountain and the Lord walked past and shielded his face. This is, again, a place saying, you're coming to the presence of God. I'm bringing you into the presence of where you need to be. That's a place where we need to be reset and pointed in the right way, don't we? We need to be in the presence of God. We need to turn our attention to him. But also a cave is a place that's not a positive place, is it? If you think about it, even in literal or metaphor, a cave is not a nice place to be. It's dark. It's dank. It's a place to be with dark thoughts, isn't it? A dark place for dark thoughts. And what we have here is that Elijah is obviously not fully where he needs to be. He's still feeling sorry for himself, I think, a little bit here. He's had the sustenance and been given what he needs, and God is guiding him along, but yet he gets to this cave and he hides in the cave. He stays in this darkness. But again, God is drawing him. He's continuing to draw him back to where he needs to be. Once in this cave, he talks to him to get his focus back on him. He asks him that question again at the start, doesn't he? Verse 9, why are you here? What are you doing here, Elijah? Elijah gives this pre-prepared speech. He says twice to God in two situations. This utter speech of despair. I'm done. I can't do it. Look, everything's gone. All your prophets are gone. I'm the last one left. Israel's rejected you. They've rejected me. There's nowhere to go from here. There's nowhere to go. I'm expecting this big grand victory like I've seen before. Fire coming down and things like that. I thought this great moment was going to happen. This great act of God was going to occur. But it hasn't worked out like that. But God asks him, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? It's a weird question to ask, isn't it? You think of God asking that question, what are you doing here? It's kind of like, you don't know God? You don't know why I'm here? But of course he knows why he's here. And this again, I think, is a wonderful moment. He's asking, not for information, but he's asking Elijah this question to give him an opportunity to unload, to get things off his chest, to pour out his heart. This is an act of communication. This is God giving Elijah that opportunity to share what he just has. The way it comes across, he's just really like, this has all happened, I've got to get this all off. When we have things that overwhelm us, that burden us, we can keep it in the cave, we can keep it locked away, can't we? We can keep it in the back of our mind, we don't share it with anyone, then it just becomes a greater burden, a greater thing. But this is a kind of technique that God has used before and continues to use throughout the Bible. You think of Adam and Eve. Where are you? He knows where they are. He's not asking them, I don't know where you are. Where are you? He's asking them to communicate with him. The Emmaus Road, when the disciples are walking, I would say in a state of depression. They're like, oh, it's all gone wrong. And Jesus comes next to them and he says, what has happened? Of course he knows what's happened, but they just need to pour it all out like they do to Jesus. So this is a great technique for all of us to understand. You can ask a question to help people unburden. You can talk to people and they can unburden. And if you're suffering and struggling right now, it's a great thing to have people around you that you can talk to and unburden and get those things out, what you're thinking and feeling. Because when you speak it out loud, when you get dark thoughts into the light, it helps you move forward. And when we think of this idea of unburdening, of getting things out, this is something, again, that we see Jesus does for us today and for all time. He can unload the burdens of our life. As it says in Matthew 11:28, "Come to me, all who labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." We unload our burdens to take on the burden of Jesus, which isn't a burden at all. It's the thing that frees us and releases us. So we see here this great technique, which I think is really helpful for those moments of depression, those moments of anxiety, those moments of fear, is communication. God is one who you can communicate to, who you can share these things with. So how do we deal with the disappointments of our life when we're overcome like Elijah? Do we run from the issue? Do we turn from God? Do we forget what he's done? Do we look for our own wisdom? Or do we do what we're shown here, that God provides, God gives us what we need and helps us through? Do we go to him? Do we turn to him? Do we look to him first? Do we see that we have people around us that he's put there in a church family, that we have accountability with one another, that we can share, that we can find gentle care and love, that we can listen to one another and not be judgmental and not force an opinion upon each other, but actually try and help through those moments, those hardships? God restores. God brings us back to him. That's what we see here with Elijah. Elijah thought it was going to happen in a big and grand way, and we can imagine that God's going to click and change things in our life straight away in a grand and great way. But notice how God speaks to Elijah in a whisper. He's demonstrating that he works in a variety of ways. Sometimes, yes, he brings the fire down when it's needed, like he did for Elijah on Mount Carmel. And other times, he whispers to those in need and brings them up gently to where they need to be. That's what we need to remember and take to heart. Let's not put God in a box he hasn't put over himself and say, God can only solve this situation in this way. Let's trust in the sovereignty of God, that he knows better than us and he can help us in all situations. And let's thank him that he can restore us. Let's thank him that he has given us a place where we can be restored in a church family, where we can be accountable to one another, where we can see there may be issues we need to change in our lives. There's obviously an issue that Elijah needs to change here. He needs to take his focus back to God. Maybe there's some pride in here. Maybe there's something that needs to go along. And maybe in that state where we're low, where we're feeling worried and anxious and fearful, depressed, there may be something we need to change in our lives. But God can show that to us and help us through. When we think of being restored, there's a great example of that in the New Testament. That's Paul. Paul is a great example of showing us what Christian life is and how to deal with the issues of persecution and things that may lead us to depression. It's turning one's attention and trusting to God. And we'll look at more of that next week when we look at Paul. But one thing I want to look at what Paul does is he turns his attention away from his needs to the needs of others in a difficult situation. In Philippians, he talks about how he knows that there's things for him to do now on this earth. He'd love to be with the Lord now. All the situations that he's facing and dealing with, he'd love to be with the Lord now, and that'd be the best place to be by far. But right now, there's things for him on earth to do. God has a purpose for him. God still has a purpose for Elijah. There's still jobs to be done. And whatever situation we're in, we must know that while we're still here on this earth, God has still got things for us to do for him to bring glory to his name. We're not done yet. And there's an interesting quote I found. It says, despair is always colourblind. It can only see the dark tints. That's what happens in times of despair and distress, anxiety and depression. We focus more and more on the dark bits, on the bad bits, and we see less and less the light. But as we see, the Lord can shine light into our lives and bring us out and bring us to focus on him. So in those discouraging circumstances, let's focus our perspective on him, on eternal things. The wonderful knowledge that God has won victory and will come again and will change all that we see around us. We may look and think this is a broken, horrible world. There's so much going on that's bad. We may be crippled with fear of seeing what's going on in the world and how we can deal in it. And there may be great affliction coming into our lives. Paul shows us in his life that he deals with this affliction as seeing it as a way of preparing him for what's to come in the future. But I don't want us to think that affliction, just affliction by itself, is of great benefit. Affliction is of benefit when we actually see that affliction in the light of God's eternal perspective. When we take ourselves out of the situation into seeing the grander picture, that God is drawing all things to when he comes again, when he brings the new heaven, the new earth, restoration of all things, and the resurrection of who we are. We're not in this moment stuck in this way forever. There is a great hope in the future, and that hope can help us to look past the situations we find ourselves in now. It doesn't take away the pain, it doesn't take away the hurt, it doesn't take away the hardship, but it helps us to work through whatever we're in. It's what the Lord wanted to show to Elijah. Why are you here? What are you doing here? Let me point you to where you need to go. Let me point you to what you need to look at. So unload our burdens. Don't keep them pent up. Look to the needs of others. Take our focus off ourselves. And also there's another thing we need to remember. Medication. Sometimes we may need medication. We may need to go to the doctor. And that's actually okay. It's a common grace that God has given us medical practitioners to help us in situations. It doesn't mean you failed as a Christian if you go to the doctors and ask for help. But also he's given us all these other means to help us, to search into his word, to pray to him, to look to him, to spend time with one another, to be accountable. So don't go into a cave. Don't disappear into darkness, but be with God. Turn your focus to him in all situations. Listen to him. Be with other people and be prepared to change. I want to finish with these words from 2 Corinthians chapter 4 again. But at the end of that chapter, verse 16 to 18 says this. Therefore we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. Let's fix our eyes on the eternal things and know God can help us in all situations. Let's pray.